Welcome to the Catbird Quilts. I'm Kathy Martin. In today's video, I want to share with you some lessons that I have learned making the Fireside Quilt in hopes that maybe it will help you too. And I have lots to say about it. You may have seen the fabric pull video that I did for this Fireside Quilt, and it was a journey of its own. And when I came into this quilt pattern, which is how I come into all quilt patterns, I'm approaching it from the viewpoint of, is this quilt pattern great for shirts? And I have an extensive process, which I've talked about before, on how I make those decisions. So very often, when I choose a quilt pattern, it does, in fact, end up being great for shirts. And because the fabric pull was a challenge, initially, I thought I'd get over that hump and it would still be great for shirts. The reality is, this particular quilt pattern, Fireside Quilt by Suzy Quilts, if you choose it and you do every single block a different combination of fabrics, it can be great for shirts. I, of course, can't do anything the easy way. The way that I chose to lay out my blocks, it ended up not being great for shirts. And along the way, I had a lot of lessons that I learned that I'd like to share with you. But first, let me just show you a glimpse of the whole quilt top. So this is the Fireside Quilt with my fabric choices. It's bigger than me and my sewing area. So I chose these particular fabrics, if you saw that fabric pull, because the recipient really likes orange and peacock blue. And in the initial choices, I had the thought that I would use a red shirt, an orange shirt for both the side and the center, and then I already had the yellow shirt and so on and so forth. So the blues are shirts, the yellow and light orange are shirts, and in the end, I realized, wow, one orange shirt is not going to carry all this distance. And so if you go with the limited color palette for this particular quilt, just know it's a fabric eater, which if you're trying to motor through your stash, maybe that's a good thing. In this case, it was really kind of a challenge because since I opted to do the orange with this block's kind of starting and ending with the orange on two separate blocks, and the blocks, as you can see, are large, there just wasn't enough fabric in one shirt. So if you decide to do the limited color palette with this quilt, you need to go into that with the knowledge of you'll need two of the same shirt if you kind of go with this same layout. Now, if you have every block different, probably good, but it is huge. And so it eats a lot of fabric. And that was a challenge for me. So lesson number one for me was, if I'm going to start and end on the same color on two separate blocks, one shirt will not cut it. You may have noticed I have my cutting mat out today, and there's a reason. With quilts like this one, and you may have noticed from that first shot with the center yellow and orange block, it has these long strips of fabric. So cutting becomes really, really important. To that point, I feel like this is maybe a little bit of a confessional. For those of you that haven't been with me here very long, I'm only into my third year quilting. So I haven't been quilting a long, long time. And every quilt I make, I discover a weakness or a shortcoming. I mean, it's starting to get laughable. Every quilt that I've made, I'm like, and on this quilt, I learned that I can't keep a straight seam allowance or whatever it is. This is a vulnerable moment here. I don't really want to confess this. I don't even really want to admit it to myself, much less to whoever watches this video. But I want this to be an encouragement to you if you find yourself in these same shoes. I really have a hard time cutting long strips of fabric straight. I don't know what it is. And I even have this wonderful ruler that I'm a big fan of. It's got a lip edge and it hooks onto the cutting mat so that it, kind of helps you cut straight, which thank God for that, because if it weren't for that, there's no telling what my strips would look like. It would be like a curvy road. But I've noticed, and I think it's really just an outworking of my personality, that when I go to cut, a lot of times I'll push into my ruler and I'll realize I'm doing it. And so then I lighten up. And so very often, actually, if I'm being totally honest, my strips have just the faintest little bend in the middle. And when I'm cutting folded fabric, it has yet to fully entrench in my skill set. This quilt may have been the one that did it. If your folded edge is not straight on the line, then when you open that fold out, you will not have a straight strip. So let me show you what I mean if you're a visual person like I am. So I'm going to use a little yardage to demonstrate my point. It just happens that I have some because I'm working on another project and I had this as remnant fabric and I was eager to use it. So yay for me, I actually have some yardage to show you. I often don't. This is with the fabric right here. It's folded, and of course, that's the width of fabric. And then I have just a little bit of it left. And what I have found is that sometimes when I go to cut my strips, I'm not careful to line up this fold on the edge on a part of my cutting mat. Now, I am a mat and ruler together user and cutter. Some people really swear by only using your ruler. I do not have 100 million rulers. I don't want 100 million rulers, so I use my mat in tandem with my ruler to do most of my cutting. And for the record, I generally do okay with most of my other piecings. It's these long strips that get me. What I have found that I sometimes do, and I'm actually going to turn this over. I've turned this fabric over 3 times trying to find the side that I'm wanting to make the point with. I will put this folded edge right here in the corner. And if it lines up here and here, then I'll just go to cutting. Now, if you were to follow this out, you can see this is on the line here, but not over here. And so what that means is there's just the slightest bit of difference. If I were to cut this, I'm going to make it really more dramatic for the point. So if I were to square this off here and then cut a strip, because this is not straight on my line, the folded strip is not like this. It's like this because that fold was not straight. And so apparently I'm a slow learner. I'm slowly starting to realize that this whole cutting on that straight folded line is super important. And most of the time when I do strips and cutting in strips, I'm subcutting them, and so it doesn't really matter. But in this particular pattern, and that's why I wanted to point this out, it takes these long strips. And so if they're not straight, it's not going to be straight. The other part of this that makes this challenging, and some of you have probably had this experience, so this is true for all quilt patterns, but I found it to be especially true for this quilt pattern, is if you have an especially large shirt and you're going to cut it into strips, getting those strips really nice and straight can be a trick. Let me show you. So here's my shirt. This is a shirt back. This is pretty typical of what I use in really a lot of my quilts. As you can see, it is wider than my cutting mat. And you might be thinking, well, turn it the other way. It is also taller than my cutting mat. It's not too long this way, but I don't happen to have a ruler that is 36 inches long. And as I just mentioned, I'm not really inclined to buy any. This is what I have. And so what that means is if I'm going to use this shirt for strips, then I'm going to have to fold it. Once the shirt has been deconstructed. I almost said decomposed. That's not what I meant. It's very irregular. We'll call it irregular. This particular shirt actually might be easier to cut into strips because it actually has these lines in the fabric, some going this way, and I can kind of see or have a sense of where the grain line is. With a solid shirt or a highly patterned floral shirt, sometimes it's a little hard to tell. And because there's no selvage to use as a starting place, how do you get it straight? So I've done a variety of things with varying degrees of success. The first I usually do is I try to put the armpits of the shirt together. And that often, honestly, does the trick. And so I'll do what I just did, which is put the, armpits together. And if I've done a good job breaking my shirt down and cut them fairly similarly, that's a really great place to go. And then I'll press it and then, cut across and make my strips. But what I have found with shirts in particular, sometimes getting that fold line really straight is a challenge. The shirt fabric may have actually gotten a little warped from use, which sometimes is not really obvious when you first start this process. And I do starch my fabric, which puts things in my favor, but sometimes right around the curved seams like the hem, the arm, the neckline, it will get a little bit of a warp in it, which makes it significantly harder to get a nice straight strip. So you can see, actually, I may have given myself the perfect example. So this is nice and straight. What would be this fold in that section, but you can tell as we go down the line, it's not really on the line anymore. So as I cut this strip, and so on and so forth down the way, that strip is going to get less and less straight and more have that bowed situation. That was a big wake-up call for me. It was like putting my shortcomings on display, like front and center with the spotlight. Kathy doesn't cut very straight strips. That was the way I felt as I was making the strips for this quilt pattern. So that's something to remember, that cutting your strips very accurately and very straight with minding your fold line can really help you have success with this quilt pattern. If you're on Instagram, you probably have heard some quilter ask the question, do you pin, do you not pin, one of those polls, like, which of the quilting police things do you not do? I will confess that pinning is kind of a hit or miss thing for me. I do, generally speaking, like pinning because I feel like it gives me that nice insurance and security that things are going to be lined up, and I don't trust that I'm going to keep it straight in my machine. So pinning for this quilt is, I would say, almost essential. Well, essential, if you put almost, it's no longer essential. It's really important. And especially if you're using shirts, which I almost always do. Sometimes the different thicknesses of the shirt or of the fabrics or the actual texture of the shirt, the sewing machine may not pull them equally through the feed dogs. And so if you're trusting yourself to kind of keep them in line and feed them through, sometimes it'll slip under the needle and you won't realize it, and they're not lined up straightly. And if they are not lined up straightly because of those big, bold blocks, it's really more evident than it is in most quilt patterns. Pinning is super important. And again, I generally am a fan. However, sometimes it's easy to think, oh, it's just this one long strip, maybe more than ever in this situation. So just remember, the time that you take to pin is going to ensure a more accurate and consistent width in your sewn block. One quick point about cutting and then pinning, and then we're going to talk about trimming. And if you feel the foreshadowing, you are paying attention correctly. if you have just the slightest variation in your strips being lined up together, or if you have not cut your long strip very straightly, it may even just be the slightest bit on this first row. But because the blocks are so large and because they're literally building one strip on another, so it's top and bottom, left and right, top and bottom, left and right. It's that courthouse steps. Every little bit adds two. So a 1/16 of an inch in one seam is not very much. But if you have 10 seams, now we're talking a whole, actually, what would that be? 1/16 of an inch times 10? Why can't I do that math? I should have said times 8. So for example, if you're a 1/16 of an inch off on one strip on both sides, you're now at an 1/8 of an inch. If you do that on the next set of strips, you're now 1/4 of an inch off. And yeah, it happens. We'll get to that. We'll get there. And also, let me be very clear. Suzy Quilts in this quilt pattern did an excellent job of highlighting these tips. In fact, so good that I got a little paranoid about it. Like, oh, I need to cut really straight. Oh, I really need to pin. Because when it comes down to it, I really am just a rule follower. If the quilt pattern designer says pin your strips, yes, ma'am, I'm going to pin my strips. And so that's a great thing. The directions are there. They're very clear. It is not a poorly written pattern. It's an excellently written pattern. But in doing so, it's almost like I psyched myself out. Do y'all remember that from the 80s? Psych. Okay, so I psyched myself out, and my overthinking, which I normally defend by calling it considerate or thoughtful, went into overdrive, and I overthought it to the point where there were problems in the end, and we'll get to that. So the next point involves my machine, as you've noticed, since I have no colored pencils over here and have my machine so close to me. By the way, I have a little sticker on my machine. It says, just breathe. Oh, I need that reminder all the time. So I use washi seam allowance tape on my machine. I was such a scoffer about this in the beginning, but it is really such a great thing. I know where on my 1/4 inch foot the 1/4 inch mark is, but when I'm handling a lot of fabric, or if I need to have a lot of accuracy, I will put my washi seam allowance tape. And actually, if I have the table extender, I'll even do it on that part too. What it does is it just kind of helps me keep myself straight. Or my fabric straight, one of the two. It keeps one of us straight. And just kind of helps me know where to look, especially if I'm doing a long strip. Fantastic, right? More insurance. It's like a safety net. And I love safety nets. I just was going to be so smart. And when I went to put my tape down, I couldn't remember exactly where to put it. Our youngest sometimes says, I forgot. As I forgot. I just forgot. I forgot. So I forgot and put my seam allowance tape on the other side of the 1/4 inch seam allowance mark, which in and of itself would not have been a big thing. I mean, my end quilt top would end up being smaller than what was called for in the quilt pattern. But if I had done that consistently, it would have been totally fine. Unfortunately, I also have a YouTube channel and have to move my sewing machine off my sewing table all the time because I'm not sewing full time. I'm pharmacisting full time and quilting part time. I moved my sewing machine, and when I did, I jerked the washi tape off and had to put it back on. So I did the yellow and blue blocks at one seam allowance. And then when I put the tape back down, I forgot again, and I didn't put it at the same place for the orange and red blocks. Now, Big deal, you say? Well, this is where the 16th inch on both sides of the block times 4 trips around the block ends up really adding up. So when I got my 2 orange and red blocks done, and I went to put them on the design wall, they were a full 1/2 inch smaller than the center block. And my heart stopped in my chest, like, what? That is not one of my shortcomings. Typically, the matching up points is like a slam dunk. That tends to be one of the things I can kind of count on about myself with quilting, is maintaining an accurate and consistent seam allowance. And then as a result, all my little points just match up nicely. And I really took it for granted. And so I realized in that process that I had moved the seam allowance tape to the wrong place. Ugh. Yuck. So I just wanted to say to those of you who maybe are not quilting in large blocks of time, if you complete a block and then come back and make another block later, just make sure your seam allowance is consistent. And if you use this washi seam allowance tape, do an excellent job of putting it in the same place that it was before. So I've pulled this back out again to give you the visual of these long strips and another aspect of this quilt that I learned, and that is your pressing technique is really important. You can see this is a strip that is sewn and folded out, and then these are sewn and folded out. And so we're going to be trying to maintain a nice square corner and a straight line. Sometimes people say straight when they mean square, and sometimes they say square when they mean straight. Square is a 90-degree angle at the corner. Straight is not, I feel like we don't want the wavy, we don't want the squiggles. We want the nice straight and then a square on a 90-degree angle corner. And that is a little bit trickier than it seems like it should be. So here I have another of these long strips, and I want to show you, well, it's really where I go wrong. It's not really where you might go wrong. It's where I know I go wrong. Now imagine this would be a big block. When it's time to press this open, you can either do seam open or toward the dark side. In this case, I'm going to do toward the dark side. What would be ideal is to finger press it kind of in the direction that it needs to go. And then, as many quilters and people with experience in this will tell you, you want to press, not iron. So this is me ironing a shirt and the strip badly. And then when I'm really at my best, this is me pressing. So you have the strip going in the direction that you want it to go, and then the iron is just going straight down on it and pressing that flat. What I have seen so many people do, and I myself have been guilty, is folding the fabric and then using the iron to press it open. Now that works. I mean, it really does get right down to that seam. However, and what I have found to be true in my own life, just the pressure of that iron going out, it will sometimes distort that part of the strip, and it will push it out a little bit further, because as you know, quilting cottons do have some give, and it's tricky to maintain a really straight line. What I did, and this is probably not a surprise to anyone, I finger pressed like one direction, and then I came back and finger pressed the other direction in an effort to make it really even and straight and uniform. And I think in my desire to make sure it's really right down there at the seam, I got a little overzealous in my my finger pressing. I did do my straight down pressing, but when I got to the corner, and as I was managing these long straight strips, this is what I was doing. Can you see how I'm fanning out like this? And so if you do that, and with the level of pressure that I was committing to this strip, it literally distorted that corner out. So I'm going like this to try to get down to the seam and then putting the iron straight down on that. And what I found is that after I had done that, my strip was not very straight anymore. And did you see me just ironing that? Gosh, it's just a hard habit to break. And I like ironing. I mean, I don't just get up in the morning and think, hey, let me iron a whole bunch of shirts. But I do enjoy it while I'm doing it. So what I found in those big blocks was when I laid it down on my cutting table to kind of check and see where it was, the center strip or the edge of the center strip had a little warpy. And so my solution to that, which seemed really smart at the time, was to trim it and make it straight. And so I got my square. Let me show you. So I had my square that I was going to use to square up the corner. And in the pattern, she suggests actually leaving a little bit of overhang and trimming that off to make that corner square. And so I did that. But what I did not realize until kind of far into it is that what I was basing the corner on was not necessarily a very straight line of the strip. And so I realized that, and actually, you probably won't be able to see it on camera, but fortunately I demonstrated it wrong, just exactly like I did on the actual quilt top. Where this is here, it bends in along that way and then comes back out and is actually stretched out in the end. I was very zealous in my trimming, especially on my red and orange blocks, because I was scared to death that they were not going to match up with that big yellow and orange. And in my quest to avoid my fate, I caused my fate. And so the combination of the inconsistent seam allowance and the super generous trimming added together to get that half inch. Oh, the emoji, just like eyes roll back in my head. Oh no. Difference between the red and the orange and that big yellow and orange center block. And that brings me to my last point, which is if they don't match up, it's not the end of the world. And I want to show you. So if you're one of my patrons over on Patreon, you can attest to the gap between the sizes. I actually took pictures and showed everyone like, oh no, there are a couple of things you can do if you find yourself in this situation. So one of them is if one block is particularly large, you can trim it down. And I seriously considered that with the orange, but the orange and, yellow words. The yellow and orange and the blue block were almost exact in size. So apparently I did not get crazy with the trimming and managed to keep a decent seam allowance. The red and orange blocks were really the biggest offenders. And so what I did is I actually seam reaped the outermost row on the red and orange block. And so what I did is I took these pieces off and I closed down my seam allowance. So I made a very scant seam allowance because I did that on the top and bottom, left and right. It gave me almost a whole 1/4 inch. It really did give a significant amount more to make those pieces much closer. So the way these are done, if you do the limited color palette, they're all the same block, and these are cut on the vertical and these are cut on the horizontal through the middle. So what I did is I lined up the blue and the orange that's going to be next to it together on that plane, this plane right here, and matched it up. Now that meant the blue was a little bit too big this direction, but I got that lined up. I did that top and bottom. And then I matched where the seam should be on the yellow. Not where it was going to be, but where it should be. And I marked that top and bottom on that center piece and made that as a row. So these, in theory, would line up. So the 3 rows were made. Row number 1, row number 2, and then the one on the bottom. And then I used this top row as the guide, put this row down on it, and trimmed it off and sewed using this as my seam allowance, because at that point this was straight. Now it was too big out here on the blue, but it was lined up pretty nicely on that, and eased it in. Which thankfully fabric, my friend Jennifer and I talked extensively about this. You can ease fabric in. You can just kind of stretch it in places, pull it a little bit. I worked paper craft before I came to quilting, and it has no ease. Paper has no ease. So thankfully, fabric has ease. So you can either take off your outermost row and make your seam allowance significantly scant, which will give you more of a shot at the blocks being the same size. And then you can line them up and mark where your seam allowance should be. And you can see that it worked. I marked my seam allowance, I sewed those together, and then sewed that second row and then sewed the rows together. And it did come together miraculously. Actually, it's math. Now, if you were to look very closely, and I think I picked the perfect corner for this, you can see this strip right here is wider than this strip, than these 2 sets of strips. Do you see that? And it's really evident right here along that line. But when it's hanging up, when I put it up on the design wall, I was like, I did it, and did not realize until I studied it. Oh, okay, it really, like, how did that well, it didn't magically happen. I made the edges work. The centers don't really match, but it's okay because the overall look is so striking, which thank you, Caitlin, for that word. I was trying to come up with the word, that descriptor. We were talking about it's not really a fun pattern, but it is visually striking. It's important that these big blocks come together at the right place on the corners. And so the way to make that work is either by, I guess in theory, you could take the whole block apart, which I was not willing to do. I was willing to take that last row, give myself a little more room in the seam allowance, and then mark where my seam would need to be and ease it on in, ease on down the road and get them together. And that's what happened. And so now I'm praying for excellent quilting to hide the rest of the mistakes. And I think it's going to come out really lovely. So I learned a lot on this quilt pattern. My shortcomings were very evident. I will not be trimming excessively in the future. I will trust myself a little bit more and not try to fearfully avoid things. I will probably just sew it like I know, and it would probably come out fine. So I learned a lot in this quilt pattern, and I hope that my missteps and shortcomings are either relatable or helpful to you. So if you take on this quilt pattern, I hope you enjoy it and have great success. I'm Kathy Martin. This is the Catbird Quilts. Thanks so much for watching.